David French, welcome back. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is for public consumption, but you told me you're just a few hours past your positive COVID test.
Yes, I'm 2 hours into at least a known case of COVID.
So we need to record this before you're flat on your back, and or you're vaccinated. So I don't know if you're going to convert to a woman all of a sudden. So we have to figure this out.
Testosterone levels are dropping by the second. No, I feel like a bad cold, and Lord willing, it won't get any worse than that. But I'm vaccinated and boosted. And the funny thing is, I went on a long run yesterday. I woke up yesterday, I felt fatigued, but we just opened up a new road near our house, and I ran the whole length of the road. I ran 8 miles.
Wow.
And then when I got done, I felt unusually tired, and I thought, And so I'm just going to go ahead and say, Skye, I had an 8-mile COVID run. I don't know if that's true. I only tested myself today when I woke up feeling bad, but so we'll see. Lord willing, hopefully it will stay. This will be as bad as it gets, but we'll see.
Well, like I said, I think 100% of people right now have COVID. Thank you.
It's amazing.
Omicron. And I'm glad that you're not under the weather enough to not be with us. So thank you for joining us. Let's hit the theme song.
Guess what day it is? Oh, it's French Friday. It's French Friday. So grab your fries and say hooray. David French is here to play on French Friday. It's French Friday.
David, this is our last French Friday of the year. This will be coming out on the 31st. So before we jump into like the serious topics, I have a non-serious thing I need to ask you really quickly. Did you see Spider-Man No Way Home?
Of course.
And
absolutely.
The verdict?
Absolute top tier Marvel. Just top tier Marvel. And I went in, everyone told me, you're going to love it. You're going to love it. And the first 20 to 30 minutes of it felt just sort of like normal Spider-Man. But I don't want to spoil any aspect of it for someone who hasn't heard it, hasn't watched it yet. But it just kicks into a whole different level. And it was poignant. Like it had heart to it. I loved it.
Yeah, I did too. I went in with low expectations. I was actually expecting to be disappointed because I thought they were going to cram too much into this. I thought Sony co-producing it was going to spoil the soup, and they didn't. So anyway, you and I have had our disagreements about some superhero franchises and movies.
True.
We agree on this one. Good to know. Okay, let's start with a recent article that was written by Kevin DeYoung. And I don't know Kevin personally. I think you might. But he wrote an article back on December 16th called The Temptation of the Jeremiad. And he argues that critiques of white evangelicals express annoyance rather than a desire to persuade. And in the article, he kind of comes after, frankly, people like you and lesser degree, not by name, but people like me who are not in pastoral roles, but nonetheless come on to social media and onto podcasts and critique some of what's going on within white evangelicalism, whether culturally, politically, theologically. And Kevin's basic argument is it's easy to critique, but we're not really doing anything constructive by this. And then it kind of got weird on social media. You responded to it. I engaged with it. So I want to kind of open up this discussion. Where do you think in Kevin's piece he made some fair points that we really need to hear?
Yeah. Well, this is something, if you are in a position where you, with some regularity, write or say things that are critical sort of the evangelical culture of the moment, I think one thing you have to be aware of is there are going to be some people who are tired of that. They're tired of hearing it. They don't feel like you get them. They don't feel like you understand where they're coming from. They feel hectored because, of course, the mainstream or legacy media is never been particularly affectionate towards evangelicals, no matter who evangelicals were supporting in American politics, even when they supported good folks. And then when you have others who are in the evangelical world who have been pretty vocal in criticism, I do think I understand why people feel like you're just kind of piling on. And I do think that is, and what's was a little bit disappointing about that is if you actually look at the body of work when I write, I am not, every week criticizing evangelicals. I'm not every newsletter criticizing evangelicals. There is a range, there are a wide range of topics, and we'll get into some of them later on. But I get it. When you are part of the receiving end of it, you're not necessarily following every time I say take on the left, or you say something about, that you're disagreeing with about sort of the religious left or the political left or whatever. People, they don't track that, but they definitely track the criticism.
Yeah. And, okay, one of the things you have done, I mean, I think this is fair to say both about you and my show with Phil and the Holy Post, is we tend to be people who are critiquing from the inside.
Right.
We're not just throwing stones from the outside.
Right.
I was an editor at Christianity Today. I've been ordained in an evangelical denomination. Phil created VeggieTales, for goodness sake. He's essentially the Walt Disney of evangelicalism, and you have long fundamentalist and evangelical roots as well. But one of the things you have done in recent years is pointed out how a great deal of the polling data about white evangelicals is revealing convictions or beliefs that seem consistently inconsistent with a Christian ethic.
Yeah.
And Kevin DeYoung points that out and said, this isn't helpful, basically, to keep pointing out that white evangelicals are being either hypocritical or unfaithful to their own stated beliefs with their cultural activism or political activism. Why do you think it is important to point out those things as an insider?
Oh, I think it's critical. I think it's absolutely critical. And here's why. So if you have a political position, and that political position is one that flows naturally and perhaps even inevitably from your theology, then you kind of get in this position where no matter what, you have to sort of say, here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. The Martin Luther stand.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and that kind of resistance, that kind of opposition can be incredibly disruptive to a body politic. If you're just in this position where my faith tells me I must do X or Y or Z. And look, if it does, it does. I mean, I spent 20 plus years as a religious liberty lawyer where I was defending people who said, here I stand, I can't do anything otherwise. That was my legal practice. But what if you're wrong? What if you're sitting there saying, I believe A, B, C, and D because I'm a Christian, when the reality is your Christianity actually doesn't have much to do with it?
Right.
And that really what's going on is you believe A, B, C, and D because it's your culture, or because it's rooted into your history, or because of basic tribalism. In other words, Team Red believes this, and I identify with Team Red. If that's the case, then things get dangerous fast. Because if you say, I am believing A, B, C, and D with religious intensity, but these things are religiously debatable, then you can begin to see how this can be disruptive. And what I wanted to point out in my piece is there's a whole host of things that white evangelicals believe, not exclusively, but disproportionately. White evangelicals are overwhelmingly more likely, for example, to believe in family separation if parents and children come across the border illegally. Now, what's the biblical principle that says you should do that? That's what you should believe? Well, I can think of the Republican principle, right? I can think of that. Or white evangelicals are overwhelmingly more disproportionately likely to believe that we should decrease even legal immigration by about 50%. Now, look, I think what level of immigration we should support is very debatable. That's a tough, hard, complicated question. But does it flow from an evangelical theology to say that we, amongst all religious groups, should be the most restrictive in our view of immigration? And so that's what I'm talking about. And that's where I think this conversation gets so important. Where do we get our ideas is a critically important question.
Yeah. And in the piece that DeYoung wrote, he agrees with you on a lot of this stuff. He recognizes some of the inconsistencies between the polling data on what white evangelicals say they believe versus what are actual Christian convictions. He ends the piece. I want to read these couple of sentences because I think this is what got me engaged and wanted to respond to him on Twitter, and I think you as well. He ends the piece this way. At the risk of seeming biased toward my own profession, I can't help but notice that the leading voices decrying the moral bankruptcy of white evangelicalism are not pastors, but professional writers, academics, and full-time commentators. Given the nature of these vocations, valuable, honorable vocations, it is easier to produce frequent Jeremiads against the church than to produce a positive vision for the church. If your natural rhythm is not the whole counsel of God Sunday after Sunday, but another critique of the church in your inbox on Sunday morning, that's kind of an interesting
That's I
detailing, but
wonder who he's talking about.
right.
Yeah.
But another critique of the church in your inbox on Sunday morning, that should tell you something. The Lord knows there is much to criticize in the church, but I doubt that relentless, unsympathetic, exasperated censure against one specific people is the best way to convince them of your criticisms, let alone build them up in Christ. So essentially, you aren't the right person to be doing this. And by extension, I would say he'd say the same about me, that it's local pastors in their congregations who know their people, who are preaching to them the full counsel of God Sunday after Sunday, who ought to be pastorally pointing out these hypocrisies and inconsistencies and leading people toward the truth. So, David, why are you taking good work away from pastors?
Yeah, that was actually the part of the whole piece that bothered me the most, not just the sort of not so veiled direct personal
Mm-hmm.
shot, but the part of it that bothered me the most, because there's a little bit to unpack here, but what it is essentially saying is that pastors are uniquely qualified to speak on basically all issues pertaining to the church, when the reality is they often don't know about all kinds of issues. I mean, and who would want pastors to have to be experts in everything? I mean, experts in the history of American race relations, experts in the history of mRNA, or experts in mRNA vaccines, experts in, civil rights law, experts in affirmative action or critical race theory. No, no, they can't possibly. They can't possibly. Are they all historians? No. Are they all sociologists? No. So what you have is you're saying, well, wait a minute, sort of stand aside and let pastors address all of these things that, with some exceptions, there are some pastors who do have very granular, specific historical knowledge here, or they have done an enormous amount of research about a sociology issue here or whatever. But as a general matter, to sort of say, stand aside while we deal with the things that we don't really know, to me is a real problem, because where the evangelical church doesn't just interact with the world on, in terms of serving the poor or, evangelism. And as I talked about in the piece, it interacts with the world on an array of political positions, just a huge array. And so who should speak about these issues? But shouldn't people, especially people who are believers, speak about issues where they have a very particular degree of expertise? I think so. I mean, I think we've got to have that. And we can't just throw that all on pastors. I mean, A, it's impossible. And then B, I also think that he really undersells the impact of this kind of commentary. I am sure he's surrounded by people who get annoyed at, they might listen to the Holy Post and they get annoyed, or they might read my Sunday newsletter and get annoyed. I know that happens. But Skye, I've seen, your Twitter responses. You should see my inbox. There are people for whom the explanation that these issues that we talk about are not, that restricting immigration or defending police who violate the civil rights of citizens, that these things aren't foundational to Christianity. Understanding that is actually a lifeline to a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's actually helps them understand that the gospel is something different from this package deal ethic of all of this politics. And it moves people and it changes people's hearts. It changes people's lives. And so I think it's a vital, and look, I'm not going to say I'm best at it by any stretch of the imagination. You and Phil are so gifted in what you do. My friend Pete Weiner is so gifted. Gosh, go listen to a Russell Moore sermon. Go listen to a Beth Moore talk. And these guys are gifted and they bring life and hope to people, not just annoyance and anger. And I think that's a really unfair way of categorizing how people who understand a lot of these issues interact with these issues within the body of Christ.
Yeah. So there's a political theory I know you are very well aware of called the unitary presidency.
Right.
And in a way, what Kevin DeYoung is arguing here for is the unitary pastoral role, that the pastor is everything and can do everything. And you're pointing out simply that that's unrealistic. Um, and it's never been the case that the
No.
pastor is supposed to be an expert in all these different areas. And we need the full body of Christ and all of the expertise and training and insight and giftedness to bring that to bear on these issues, which I'm grateful that you and others do. But here's the other side of it, though, is you could interpret his critique here at the end as not just that pastors should be doing these things, but if you're going to do them as an academic or a commentator or a writer, can you please be more pastoral in your approach?
Right.
Can you be gentler? Can you
Yeah.
be more of a shepherd rather than a prophet? What do you make of that? Do you think there's a different way we should be approaching these critiques to be more effective, to actually persuade rather than, as he would put it, condemn?
Yeah. That is something, honestly, I think about all the time, Skye. I think about this all the time. And if you've read like my writing about vaccines or conspiracy theories, one of the things that I say constantly is that you're not going to fact check people out of this. You're not going to hector them out of these conspiracy theories. What you have to do is you have to enter into relationships with people. You can't replace something with nothing. For a lot of people, these conspiracy theories provide a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. And so you have to provide a better purpose and a better meaning. And so I have said that, and I've said things like that till I'm blue in the face. You can't condescend to people. You can't hector people. But I think what maybe Kevin and some others don't realize is who am I speaking to? Okay, who am I speaking to? I am not speaking to Aunt Jane, who is deep in Q.
Right.
That's not who is reading my Sunday newsletter. Who's reading my Sunday newsletter might be her nephew, Bob, who's a lawyer who only sees her, on Thanksgiving and Christmas, can't quite seem to figure out what's happened to her and wants to understand where this is going and what's going on. So a writer has to know who their audience is. And what happens a lot of times is people will write and say, well, you're not writing in a way that's going to persuade QAnon Jane. Well, QAnon Jane isn't my audience. QAnon Jane isn't reading my stuff. The people who tend to be reading my stuff are people more like pastors who are often interacting with QAnon Jane, and they don't know where these ideas are coming from. They don't understand. They're learning often where they're interacting with congregants about critical race theory, and they're learning right along with their congregants. And so what I'm trying to do is write for people who want to learn, and writing in the areas where I have at least some knowledge. Now, there's a lot of things, Skye, I'm not going to write about. A lot of things I'm not going to write about because I don't have knowledge in those areas. And so that's who you're writing for. And people will constantly be saying, well, your writing isn't going to persuade, a guy in a MAGA hat. Well, they're not.
Right.
That's not who the audience is. The audiences are the folks who are interacting with the guy in the MAGA hat and trying to understand the guy in the MAGA hat.
Yeah. And there's some biblical wisdom in that. Jesus was clear that, those who have ears, let them hear. And he knew that most people weren't going to receive his message, which is part of the reason he used parables. And you get the gettable ones, and there's a lot who aren't gettable, and that's okay. Part of my beef with DeYoung's issue here is I on one level I agree with him. I wish more pastors were doing this work and doing it in a caring, pastoral, shepherding kind of way, and pointing out some of the problems that are being cultivated among their own people, and conspiracy theories and anti-vax and conflating MAGA values with Christian values. Pete Wehner wrote that wonderful piece recently about Don Jr. saying we need to basically abandon Jesus' teachings if we want to be politically successful. So I wish pastors were calling this out. And I know there are some who are. There are some very faithful pastors who are being wise in the way they do it, but they are calling it out. But frankly, there are a ton of pastors who aren't. There are a lot who are remaining silent. Right. And they're doing it out of self-preservation. Because they will risk their jobs, their livelihood, their family, and just an enormous amount of conflict and upheaval in their congregations if they go after some of this stuff. And I just found it a bit ironic that he used Jeremiad in his title and throughout the piece, because that comes from Jeremiah, who was a prophet who spoke really harsh words against God's own people, including critique of the shepherds of Israel, the kings and the priests and the Levites and others who should have been shepherding the people well, that God had enormously condemning messages for. And so here's Kevin DeYoung, ironically saying the same thing to people like you that the leaders of Israel were saying to Jeremiah, which is, can you please be quiet? Can you not be so hard on our hypocrisies? And by doing so, Kevin is putting himself in the seat of the very people that ended up killing Jeremiah and, eventually the Messiah himself. So the blind spot here was just odd to me, that sometimes throughout Scripture, you see God using people on the periphery in a prophetic way because their own leaders have too much vested interest in the system to critique it.
Well, I think if there's two things. So one, there's two sides of this coin. One side is what I talked about earlier, which is we cannot reasonably ask pastors to know everything about everything that's hot button in American life, especially since it's very trendy. I mean, things come and go in 6-week spans or less. The other thing is we have to recognize that people have different body parts. They have different roles. And so pastors, I remember speaking to a pastor, and I'm going to write about this. And he said, I want you to understand the position that I'm in. If I have a MAGA congregant, somebody who's been, he's all in on Trump, and he's been, I've been his pastor for 30, 35 years. And I give a sermon where I talk about, these sort of values in a way that he unmistakably feels attacked. And he has cancer. He's not going to let me come see him. He's not going to let me minister to him in this moment of ultimate distress because I have so deeply wounded him and offended him in other areas. Now, that doesn't mean that pastors shouldn't on occasion say things that cause some outrage in their congregation, but they have to be, just to use the scripture, wise as a serpent, harmless as a dove. You have to know, you're shepherding a flock here, and it's not necessarily your job at all times to be sort of correcting this or correcting that.
Right.
And so you've got a balance here. Whereas with me, that's not quite the same. It's not the same situation. I'm not going to be ministering to that guy in the hospital anyway. I haven't been growing up with a family and baptized people's kids that are now, at odds with me politically. It's just a very different situation. And so interestingly enough, I think what ends up happening is there's actually a symbiotic way in which you can interact with pastors here. Pastors have a role that I do not have. And that role is complicated. That role is difficult. We should give a lot of grace to pastors. Heck, 38%. I don't know if you saw the Barna numbers here.
Yep.
38% are considering quitting, which is just stunning. So we need to be giving an awful lot of grace to pastors who are navigating difficult times. At the same time, there are other voices that in the areas that they know and understand, I think can have a symbiotic relationship because they're still able to say things that are true. And although we take slings and arrows for doing it, it's not quite the same. It's not the kind of thing where all of a sudden a church is falling apart.
Yeah.
It's, and so this is really difficult, tough stuff. And I think one of the kind of weird takeaways I had from this is Kevin is really wanting pastors to take on so much. And I can't imagine somebody taking on all of that in the way, in the way that he seemed to envision there.
Yeah, I'm not as convinced that he actually wants that. I don't know. Like I said, I don't know him personally, but I think he is a pastor. I've been a pastor, and I know that it's easier to not have people outside critiquing what's going on and just trust, the pastors will deal with it. When maybe I'm being too hard on people from my own vocation because I've been there, but there's been studies that have shown, I think Lifeway came out with one saying that most pastors, they don't want to talk about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
They just don't want to deal with it. And I appreciate you're trying to be very compassionate and empathetic towards those pastors who have faced incredible difficult years here and are on the bubble and thinking about leaving the ministry. But on the flip side, part of the reason things are so difficult right now is because pastors have been silent for too long.
Yeah.
When you don't talk about the public or social implications of the gospel, when you don't talk about issues of race, when you're in a community where there's a lot of immigration, including undocumented immigration, and you never talk about it from the pulpit, when these issues do become acute in the society, or they do become political hot potatoes and fodder for conspiracy theories, if you've never talked about it, it's that much harder to bring it up now in the heat of the moment.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem is we've abandoned so many of these areas of discipleship to the media. And then we're shocked to discover that Fox News or InfoWars or QAnon is shepherding our people in these areas that we've refused to talk about. And it doesn't mean that a pastor needs to be an expert on all these areas, but they do need to have some guidance for people on the public dimensions of their faith.
Well, just to underline, to put underline, exclamation point, bold, italicize, every other kind of way of emphasizing what you just said. One thing that I think is incredibly interesting, and this is some research that just came out here in the last couple of days, is the change in the percentage of people who believe that personal immorality is consistent or inconsistent with ethical performance of official duties.
Right.
Okay. In 2011, no American group has moved more on this issue than white evangelicals.
Right.
And it's not close. In 2011, only 30% believed that personal immorality was consistent with an ethical performance of official duties. Today, it's 72%. That's a 42-point shift. And what that tells me is there's no theological formation here.
Right.
At all. That what you have is a tribal formation, not a theological formation. It is a tribal formation. And for a while, evangelicals could say, heck yeah, we believe personal immorality matters. We were against Bill Clinton.
Right. It's the character counts mantra.
It's the character counts. It's the 1998 Southern Baptist Convention Statement on Character in Politicians. And then all of a sudden, when convictions collide with political expediency didn't just win, it won in a rout. And so what I would love is there a pastor who can explain to me how theologically it is appropriate, that this shift is theologically appropriate? Because I've thrown down that challenge for week after week, month after month, year after year. And what I get in response isn't that it's theologically appropriate. What I get is you have to understand it. I understand it. I live in Tennessee. My neighborhood, Skye, is 85% Republican. If there is anything that I understand, it is support for Donald Trump. I am saturated, surrounded by it. So please don't come at me with you have to understand. I understand. But understanding is not the same thing as justification. And so that shift, that 42-point shift, tells me that there was some bedrock, there was a problem with bedrock theological formation. And if you think that, well, that's just the non-church going evangelicals. I mean, some of the best data we have says that the more you go to church, the happier you are with Donald Trump, even now, even after January 6th.
Yeah. Just to wrap this one up, it feels like what you've been doing, what a lot of what we've been doing on the Holy Post is pointing out the failure of discipleship in a lot of the church, the failure of spiritual formation in various segments of the church. And I think what Kevin DeYoung is pointing out is pastors really don't like being told that. So can you tone it? Can you tone it down a little bit and trust the pastors to do this work? Because it's their calling, it's their job. And we're kind of saying, yeah, we would love for them to be doing this work. We'd love for the churches to be forming people in their values and views in public and private life. But the evidence is getting kind of insurmountable, overwhelming that it's not working. And we need to raise the alarm here. And we're getting called out for raising the alarm. And I think
honestly, this might sound grim, Skye, but you tell me if you think I'm wrong. I think when it comes to politics, Charlie Kirk and Donald Trump Jr. have the ear of more American Christians than any single American Christian pastor.
Yes, I don't think you're wrong. And that should terrify us.
That should really be alarming. Yeah.
Okay, let's transition to the other story, which I wanted to talk about, which you wrote about most recently and have gotten also quite a bit of blowback for. But it's
From a different direction.
A very different direction. Yeah, but important and an area where I think you have unique perspective and expertise, which most pastors don't, which is why we wanted to talk to you about this. So the New York Times published this incredibly detailed, exhaustive look led by Azmat Khan, who uncovered how the Pentagon has been for years and years and years underreporting the number of civilian deaths caused particularly by drone strikes, covering 3, perhaps even 4 now, U.S. administrations. So George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and did they get any reporting as recently as the Biden years, or I don't think so.
I don't know that they have. Yeah.
But anyway, this is not a partisan critique of one party or another, their approach to these wars. And it's kind of opened the eyes for at least the people who read the article of the real costs of these wars.
Yeah.
And the perception that many Americans have had is that using drones limits the exposure of U.S. servicemen and women to combat situations and dangers. And it's a way of eliminating threats and terrorists in quote unquote surgical strike sort of way. And at one point, you point this out in the article as well, that in April of 2016, the Pentagon reported killing more than 25,000 ISIS combatants, but said they only killed 21 civilians in the process, which it's just hard to believe in general, but it definitely was proven to be untrue. So first, before we get into your piece a little bit, explain more of what the New York Times revealed that you found troubling about the Pentagon's reporting.
Yeah. So first, let me just give a shout out to that reporting team. That was some incredible reporting. When you're talking about in-depth reporting from war zones, these guys risked their lives to do this. And it was really remarkable reporting. So there's a couple of things that I found troubling. One is they paint a pretty darn compelling picture that the Pentagon was just, if not outright deceptive, extremely trusting of its own metrics. Okay. So that, in other words, if you don't have an immediate negative report on the outcome of a strike, it goes down in the books as a proper strike. So in other words, if you don't have an immediate complaint, hey, you hit a wedding, or hey, you hit an innocent family, it doesn't trigger that investigatory apparatus. Okay. So you just move on to the next one. And so in the way the whole system works is, and just going by in this is overbroad, but as a general reality, the way the system works is you're moving on from target to target to target, and you're not going back and re-looking at everything you just struck unless there's a reason to do so. So what the New York Times did was go back and look at everything that was hit. And what they found out was it wasn't nearly as precise as 25,000 ISIS casualties and 21 civilian casualties, which basically anyone who'd spent any time downrange could have told them. But it still has to be proven. I mean, when I was there during the surge in 07-08 with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, we had boots on the ground, and we were incredibly careful, and we even lost people, including a dear friend of mine, because we were so careful. And we didn't have a ratio of 1,000 to 1 on military casualties to civilian casualties. We had far more military casualties that we inflicted than civilian, but it wasn't 1,000 to 1. So from that standpoint, I feel like the Pentagon just flat out dropped the ball on reporting. Part of that is the product of their system. Part of that is the product of maybe an intentional lack of curiosity. Part of that is a product of people being told what they want to, telling others what they know others want to hear. No aerial campaign in the entire history of the human race, no matter how precise your weapons or how accurate your weapons, can be that precise. And so
Right.
that's critically important information for us to have.
So the worst possible spin on the Pentagon's underreporting is that they just don't care about the lives of Iraqi or Syrian or Afghan civilians, and that's why it was reported the way it was. Um, Not ready to go that far, but there were certainly political incentives, military incentives for not reporting or not pouring the resources into finding out a more accurate number of civilian
Yeah.
deaths. In your piece, however, and what brought criticism upon you is that
Yes.
you articulated that it isn't just the Pentagon who's culpable for those civilian deaths. It is also the enemy combatants. It's the terrorists
Yeah.
in these countries that are somewhat responsible. And you cite the law of armed conflict.
Yeah.
So briefly explain, what is the law of armed conflict and how does it apply to this issue of drone casualties?
Yeah. So the law of armed conflict is it's so there's sort of two. Let's just back up for a bit. There's kind of two general concepts when it comes to the law of war. One is called just ad bellum. In other words, just war. Do I have just reason to fight a war? And then the other one is called jus in bellum. That is justice in war. Am I fighting the war in a way that is lawful? And there are some basic principles of the law of armed conflict. It's very simple in concept, very difficult in application. One is military necessity. Every strike has to be justified by military necessity. The other one is humanity. You're going to want to do so in a way, if you're going to if you're going to fire a weapon, drop a bomb, you want to do so in a way that is not going to cause unnecessary suffering. So, under this kind of distinction, there are entire categories of weapons that just violate the law of armed conflict. You can't use these weapons. And then another one is called proportionality. So, in other words, if a sniper is shooting at me from a village, I can try to kill the sniper. I can't flatten the whole village. Okay, so that's proportionality. And then the other one is called distinction or discrimination. And this is the one that gets very applicable. So under distinction and discrimination, you have a responsibility to try to distinguish between civilian targets and military targets. So that makes total sense. That's part of military necessity. And the other one, though, this is the other interesting thing. You have a responsibility as a participant in armed conflict to distinguish yourself from the civilian population. So that's why a army wears uniforms. That's why tanks have insignia. That's why aircraft have, that American, distinctive and American insignia or Russian insignia on them. So military members of the military distinguished themselves from the civilian population. In fact, even in counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare, insurgents are supposed to wear distinctive insignia, distinctive kinds of clothing, so that you're not attacking civilians in your effort to defeat an enemy. Okay.
And then, okay, I mean, in traditional historic warfare, that was pretty obvious, right? Armies
Right.
had uniforms, and they would line up and pull out their muskets and off. It was clear who the bad guys were, who the combatants were. The United States has been involved in numerous military conflicts where that wasn't so easy to tell, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of jungle warfare in Vietnam, guerrilla warfare in various smaller skirmishes in various parts of the world. And certainly when it comes to the war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan and in Syria, that's not clear. What incentive is there for an ISIS fighter to wear a uniform and
Well, so
distinguish themselves? Other than the only reason I can think of doing that is you do it to protect your own people, right? Because you don't want your civilians accidentally hit. And so you distinguish yourself saying, here I am, make sure you hit me, not them.
yeah.
But that's not necessarily how you win a war.
Right. Well, so in World War One, in World War Two, and in Korean War, and much of the Vietnam War, though not all of it, we were fighting North Vietnamese regular army soldiers. In the Gulf War, the first phase of the Iraq War, there's been a lot of wars, even in relatively recent history, where we fought uniformed services. But the fact that somebody says, I can't beat the U.S.
Right.
if I wear a uniform doesn't relieve them of the legal obligation. Okay. So to say the laws of war attach no matter whether or not you get an advantage from them or not. And so then the way the laws of war work is when you don't comply with the laws of war, there are disincentives. For example, war crimes tribunals, or you have lesser protections. If you're in civilian clothing and you're not wearing distinctive insignia and you're captured, there are lesser protections for hostile combatants than for prisoners of war under
Right.
the various conventions. And so essentially what happens is you're trying to place the burden of the failure to comply with the law on those who fail to comply. Now, because we are although there have been war crimes that we have committed, by and large, we're extraordinarily, by any meaningful historical standard, we're extraordinarily protective of civilian life compared to other major powers. So we impose a moral duty on ourselves above and beyond the law of armed conflict, but the legal duty on the enemy still remains. So that's why I said, as a matter of law, if an enemy is completely defying the laws of war, and as a result of their defying the laws of war, civilians are killed in the effort to attack the enemy, that responsibility is primarily borne by the party that defies the law of war. And not by the party that's trying to comply. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to create a legal system that says there are incentives and protections that you receive if you comply with the laws of war. If you do not comply with the laws of war, there are disincentives and punishments that accrue. And that's proven very difficult to enact in real life, but that's the ideal anyway.
Okay. In theory, I agree with you on this. And in theory, I can understand why many of the civilian casualties that resulted in Iraq and Syria are not fully the responsibility of the Pentagon or the American military, but there is a culpability upon the ISIS fighters or the Iraqis or others who were enemy combatants who shielded themselves in civilian locations, hid among civilian populations. However, if that's the case, why then is the Pentagon so reluctant to admit how many civilians died in their strikes, given they could legally place the blame for those civilian deaths on their enemies?
I think the answer to that is actually pretty easy. And that there's a couple of things here going on. One is the American people really, even though the enemy is primarily responsible for the casualties that accrue when they hide amongst the civilian population or wear civilian clothes or use civilian objects like mosques and hospitals and private homes, even though they're primarily responsible, the American people do not want to be killing civilians for all kinds of really wonderful, good reasons. And so I believe there's a sense that there's a limited reservoir of support, public support that exists. The other thing I think is that I really do believe you get into a group dynamic where in the absence of negative information, positive information is presumed. If you go back and you look at this New York Times report, a lot of the civilian strikes, it took them weeks, months to put together the jigsaw puzzle, to figure out what happened, why it happened. And so what ends up happening, this is just a very human thing. If you don't have an immediate negative feedback, you presume that what you've done is you've accomplished your mission. So I think there's a couple of things going on. I think one, you have poor information coming up, radiating up from the ground. You have every incentive to try to demonstrate that your targeting is incredibly precise, your munitions are incredibly precise, that you've sort of hacked warfare. In other words, that, hey, we figured out a way to fight a war that is as precise as it's ever been in history. And that might actually be true, but it's not as precise as you're portraying. And so then what ends up happening is that when the reality and the truth is known, A, you lose an enormous amount of credibility. And then B, what the sort of the underlying moral truth of the war gets lost. So, when I was talking about the responsibility of ISIS and Al Qaeda and Taliban to not attack from civilian locations to not wear civilian clothes. All of that just got totally lost in the conversation. Like it didn't matter. Nobody cared. But that's a fundamental reality why it is so incredibly hard. And if you say, well, because it's so hard, we shouldn't be over there. I will tell you, when I was there in Iraq, the number one target of Al Qaeda in our area of operations was not us. It was ordinary Iraqis eating in restaurants. It was ordinary Iraqis in schools. It was ordinary Iraqis in hospitals. And if we left Al Qaeda alone because we weren't sure about our targeting, they could plan and carry out suicide bombings with impunity. And when I was there, our area, Diyala province, was known as the female suicide bombing capital of the world because there were so many female suicide bombers. And stopping that onslaught of death was an absolute imperative for us. And to just sort of wash your hands of it and say, it's hard, we might miss, so we're going to let them plan. No, we couldn't do that. So we had to make these incredibly, incredibly tough calls.
Okay, let's, I want to take a step back and look at the past and then look at the future a little bit. So the argument you've essentially made here is the New York Times piece comes out and says, hey, U.S. military strikes from drones killed a lot more civilians than we were led to believe, and that's bad on us. And you're saying, hold on, take a step back. Yes, it's terrible, but part of the problem wasn't just our military strikes, it was the insurgents and the terrorists themselves and their approach to war that led to these civilian deaths in the first place. Couldn't you just take the argument back a step further and say, yeah, but there's a lot of us who think we shouldn't have been in Iraq in the first place?
Yeah.
So how far back do you go? I mean, I think that's one of the reasons this story has attracted so much attention is we all knew that there was a heavy price paid in Iraq. Thousands of U.S. service people died. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died. But to see in detail how some of these drone strikes were played out makes us feel that much guiltier about a war that many people felt like wasn't justified in the first place. So can't you just take a step back further and go, well, we wouldn't have been in this mess in the first place if it wasn't for American bravado, perhaps, and lack of insight before we're jumping into this war? Is that a fair argument or not?
It's interesting. It's a changing of the subject in some ways. Because if you're arguing about military tactics and you say, well, okay, you're right, but we shouldn't have been there anyway, that's a complete change of the argument. But let me put it like this. That doesn't apply to Afghanistan. We were going to Afghanistan after 9/11. I would argue it doesn't apply to ISIS. I mean, we had pulled out of Iraq by 2011. ISIS storms through northern Syria, northern Iraq, starts inspiring and planning terror attacks in our European allies. It commits genocide. It's selling women into sex slavery. I have not met too many people who say we shouldn't have fought ISIS. Okay. We shouldn't have rolled back ISIS.
Yeah, but there's the argument that ISIS was the aftermath of Iraq, which was the result of the American invasion.
Sure. I get that. But, and so I do think that for most of the most recent aspects of American war, what we're talking about is a situation where there wasn't an easy alternative path to the path that we took. Regarding the Iraq war itself, I continue to support it. I continue to believe that it was an appropriate military action. And that's an argument not a lot of people like to have anymore. There were ample reasons under the law of war as to why it was a just war. And I think there were many, many mistakes that we made. But by 2010, 2011, when Obama pulled out, it was over. We had defeated Hussein. We had defeated the follow-on insurgency. Some of the best estimates is that there were a grand total of 800 al-Qaeda fighters left in the whole country. And we just left. And so, you create this enormous vacuum, and it was filled by the worst people in the world. And so,
which is the same fear we all hold about Afghanistan now.
Exactly. Yeah. And, they're looking at mass atrocities. They're looking at potential mass starvation right now. I mean, it's just an unbelievable nightmare. And one thing that I wish that, if we're talking about military actions, a lot of these decisions are so hard. And because here's a reality, evil often leaves virtue with few good options. What do you do about a genocidal dictator? What are the good options there? What are the good options for dealing with just to take what Al Qaeda did in our area of operations? This is how they would, quote unquote, recruit female suicide bombers. They would rape young women and tell them the only way they could redeem their honor was to blow themselves up. Okay, how do you deal with that? There isn't an easy, clean, neat roadmap for dealing with that. And so you have this incredible evil that is leaving virtue with very few good options. And the one thing that I would say is, look, and I said this in a Twitter thread, if we were reckless, if we were negligent, or God forbid that we intentionally targeted civilians, which we certainly never did when I was deployed, you should hold Americans accountable. But Americans should know that we have a military that is so careful about civilian casualties that we often had people like me standing beside every commander making a decision, a JAG, a lawyer, to try to run these things through the law of armed conflict, which is a pretty novel approach to waging war, is having that double check, that second set of eyes. And we did this all the time as a matter of course. And one of the things that I would say is there are many American casualties. These folks who came home in flag draped coffins were in those coffins because they were being careful. And that's something I wish was understood by folks who are lashing out at the American military for, these civilian casualties.
I think your point is a really important one, that sometimes evil leaves you no good options.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reason that I can't yet embrace a fully pacifist Christian ethic, because I also, I agree with that. And in the heavy, heavy costs, I have counseled returning soldiers, PTSD stuff. I mean, just the psychological trauma that so many of these women and men face because of what we've asked them to do, let alone the people who've lost limbs and their lives and all. I mean, it's horrific, the cost of war. And I don't want to diminish those sacrifices in any way. All that to say, that's why it's so important that our political leadership take these decisions of conflict super seriously.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
And not wage these. Thinking back to when the whole country was debating whether or not we should invade Iraq during the George W. Bush administration. And I forget what holiday we were gathered. My wife's side of the family, we were all gathered. My wife's grandfather was still alive at the time, and he was a career Marine his whole life.
Mm-hmm.
He flew fighter jets in Korea. He was kind of the patriarch of the family and generally quiet. And he sat there very stoically at the table while the whole family was debating the Iraq thing, and people were on different sides of it. And finally somebody said, "Grandpa, what do you think?" And now Grandpa was from Texas, Republican. Frankly, he had some very racist views about just tradition. He just was a very old school white guy. And so I was fully prepared. I assumed I knew what his point of view was going to be. Big, huge George W. Bush fan. Somebody asked, "Grandpa, what do you think?" And he just quietly said, "I've seen war. And war is terrible.
Mm-hmm. And
you never go to war unless it's absolutely necessary." And in his view at the time, he said, "I don't think this war is necessary." And it just, the whole table got silent. Like it was over. None of us had the credibility on the issue that he had. All that to say, like it is such a heavy, heavy price that we need to be careful, which leads me to the conversation I want to have about the future here and in the final minutes we have. And that this whole story from the New York Times about drones and this form of warfare is perplexing to me on the ethical front, because on one side, this technology reduces the likelihood that American servicemen and women are going to be put in harm's way in certain conflicts because we can strike from a distance. And to your point, you took great care to avoid civilian deaths because you had boots on the ground. You could more easily distinguish, or at least attempt to distinguish, friend from foe or civilian from combatant. It's a lot harder to do that from 30,000 feet. So it reduces the cost of war in U.S. lives if we fight it with drones. But it doesn't necessarily reduce the cost of war for the civilians on the ground who get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. What does that do then to the future when we have to make decisions as a people about whether or not we should authorize military engagement in a place, knowing it's not going to probably cost our sons and daughters their lives as much as it had in the past? It's going to cost them their lives. Does that lead to bad ethical decision making? I mean, it's a little bit like in the Cold War, there was mutually assured destruction,
Right.
which kept us from pulling the trigger because it would be our
Yeah.
destruction. Well, there's a degree to which you're hesitant to pull the war trigger because American lives are going to be lost in this. But if the number of American lives is that few, does it make it easier to pull the trigger?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And I do think that's why it is so important, that why the New York Times reporting was so valuable, because it shows that we did not, and I'm going to go back to this phrase, sort of hack war, that where we figured out a way to fight a war where no Americans die and only enemies die. We have not figured that out. That does not exist. And so that's one of the real values of this New York Times reporting, because what it does is it shows you and it tells you that war is horrible. War is horrible. The other thing, which I don't think really comes through the reporting, is it's actually not necessarily the case that when our boots are on the ground, it's easier on civilians. One of the things that's a reality is that when conflict happens, when our boots are on the ground, it is often far more destructive. So I'll give you an example from our own deployment. We had a situation where some Al-Qaeda fighters ambushed one of our vehicles from a mosque. So they're firing from a mosque at our vehicles. And there were a bunch of Al-Qaeda fighters sprinkled throughout the entire city. And the village, and the whole village just lights up with machine gun fire, rocket-propelled grenades. And our guys spend the next 36 hours fighting for their lives. 36 hours. In a 36-hour firefight, how much of that village was left? Not much. Not much. Ironically enough, we were so disciplined and had been drilled in our heads so much not to shoot at mosques, that the mosque was one of the most intact dwellings left. And so I think what your grandfather's saying, I've seen war. I think the message is there's no way to make war anything but war.
Yeah.
And if we try to communicate to the American people that there's a way to do that, we're just wrong. And in fact, I would argue we had a big problem before the Iraq War, in that for several years, from going from Desert Storm to the Balkans to really the first 100 days or so of the war in Afghanistan, it was like we figured this thing out. We win, they lose, we take very few casualties, and we can topple regimes, we can defeat big armies, we can defeat terrorists. And then, after the insurgency developed in Iraq and after the Taliban insurgency really developed in Afghanistan, all of that just went away. Like this sort of notion that we figured it all out. And so I think that that's a very, very, very important message, is there is no way to make war not war. And we have to have that drilled into our heads. And even if American soldiers or American pilots are not dying in conflicts, we have not figured out how to kill only enemies.
But
The other thing is,
sorry to interrupt, but that's the part that concerns me is, war is war, and we haven't figured out a way to not kill non-combatants. But if those non-combatants aren't Americans, isn't it still lowering the cost for the American psyche to say, well, it's not my sons and daughters, our sons and daughters who are dying. It's those random people I have no connection to over there. And it's inhumane and it's sick, but there's still it doesn't have the same weight.
Yeah.
And that's what concerns me, is now we've become an empire where it's not our blood being spilt, it's others, and it makes it easier to spill it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a truism of human nature that
Right.
it is that is an absolute. I mean, there are very few Americans who by 1945 were grieving German and Japanese civilian casualties.
Right.
Very few. I think that's absolutely, totally the case. But it is also the case, I think, that in the American people, there is still a limited tolerance, that the American people want our military to be moral. They want
Of
our
course.
military to be discriminating in its tactics. And by and large, the good news is that it is. That's the good news. It is. Here's the really, really bad news. The really, really bad news is that we fight an enemy that recklessly, lawlessly tries to blur the distinction between soldier and civilian. The bad news is that even with all of the best technology that money can buy and optics that would just astonish you with their accuracy, we still have to make judgment calls. And sometimes those judgment calls are right, and sometimes they're terribly wrong. And I had to make some of those judgment calls with to advise a commander when I was in Iraq. And to this day, I just get a shudder down my spine when I think about what could have happened had we got some of those calls wrong. I wrote in my piece about a situation where an Al-Qaeda fighter literally picked up a toddler, like an older toddler, and was running with this baby in his arms, carrying the baby like a football. And even though under the laws of war, we had the ability to engage him, not one of our troopers had the heart to do it. Not one of them had the heart to pull the trigger. And A, that tells you something about the guys in uniform, and B, it also tells you something about who we were fighting.
Yeah.
And I just wanted people to know that about our enemy as they were thinking through all of these things.
And I've heard similar stories from other returning soldiers that I've talked to, and worse, horrible stories. The recent stat I saw is that roughly 460,000 people have died in Iraq since the war started. And I don't know what the casualty count is for U.S. soldiers or allied soldiers in Iraq. You may know that better than I do. But I wonder if you could go back in time to 2003, as the American public is debating this question of whether or not we should invade Iraq, and you could say to them, in 18, 20 years, this decision, if you go to war, is going to cost close to 500,000 lives. But you don't tell them how many of those lives are Americans and how many are Iraqis. Would that have changed the decision?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the issue in Iraq, and this is something that goes back to the war, the justification for the war itself, which is, if you were under the impression that Saddam Hussein had a viable weapons of mass destruction program and had the willingness to use it, then you're talking about extraordinary mass casualties.
Sure. And that's exactly what led to the war, that belief.
Yeah. And if you knew there were WMDs in Iraq, but it was not the program that we thought there was. If you know that that's the case, and instead you're saying, okay, what we're fighting a guy who's committed genocide against his own people, who's tried to kill a former American president, who shoots at American airplanes, enforcing, UN approved no-fly zones, who, down the line of all of the things that he did, who's a big supporter of the Intifada in Israel, and you go down all of the things that he did, to me, that's a lot tougher call. That's a lot tougher call.
Yeah.
To be honest. But again, we kind of had this beta test of what happens to one of these genocidal Ba'athist regimes when you don't invade and it's inherently unstable, and that's Syria.
Right.
And so this idea, again, you're talking about how does evil leave virtue with good options? We took a different approach in Syria. In Syria, we said, nope, we're not going to intervene until ISIS rose, and then it was very, very limited. And the slaughter in Syria is just one of the modern world's great, horrible, horrifying tragedies. And the refugee crisis it triggered helped destabilize Europe. I mean, it's horrifying. And so that's why I keep going back to that point.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you. I just feel like with this technology and the drone warfare that the United States and its allies has pioneered, we are changing the calculus.
Yeah, and I don't dispute that. Yeah.
And the cost to us in blood, at least, maybe not treasure, but in blood, is likely to reduce, but it doesn't change necessarily that calculus for the civilians in the places that we may need to go to war. And that concerns me. So just as no doubt in the future, we will face other decisions, and the American public will, in one way or another, through voting and just its own media engagement, make some of these decisions. I wish that there may be no good options, but I don't want it to just be a case of, well, it's not my blood being spilled, so let's go do
Yeah.
it. That's the concern. And I think as Christians, we need to think about, what does this mean ethically
Absolutely.
for the future warfare? And few people think more deeply and thoroughly about this stuff than you do, which is why I wanted to engage you on it. David, thank you for the whole year. You've been on our podcast so many times and have contributed so much, and we're really grateful for it.
Oh, it's been such an honor and a pleasure. And we don't talk about deep subjects, do we?
Well, that's why we needed the Nerd Fest last month, so we could
I
just
know.
cleanse ourselves of all this seriousness and talk about meaningless things. We'll do it again in the future for sure. But very much appreciate you. And despite having a positive COVID test, your mind was quite clear today. So thank you for giving us your time and energy when you should be resting.
Well, I can't wait to listen to it and think, okay, well, anything bad I said was due to COVID fog. Let's just we'll put it out there. If there's anything I said that sounded crazy to you, just give me the grace of attributing it to COVID fog.
All right, everyone hear that? So in the comment section, just attribute it to COVID fog. And we will, hopefully you have a wonderful new year, and we'll be back in January. We'll schedule that for another French Friday.
Look forward to it.
French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jitani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of The Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.